Where do I even start with this video? For years, I've been a big fan of Swamp Thing. He's one of my favorite DC characters. I suppose a lot of the appeal comes from my love of horror and the common idea of the humane monster who's cast out from society. I also owe a lot of my appreciation to the brilliant writing of Alan Moore, whose work on Swamp Thing is one of the best comic runs I've ever read. Swamp Thing saw his fair share of adaptations back in the 80s and 90s, with 2 movies as well as both a live-action and animated TV show. While I quite enjoy Wes Craven's Swamp Thing, none of that media ever adapted his material right, coming off more as campy than scary.
The big green guy is back.
They call me Swamp Thing.
You're a plant, aren't you?
Swamp Thing would eventually disappear from most media for quite a while. It wasn't until May of 2019 that we would see him return in the form of a new show on DC Universe. The show tested well after its first episode, leaving everyone anticipating more. What happened next was a complete surprise. There's actually quite a lot that happened with the show behind the scenes. The show was originally intended to have 13 episodes, but was later cut down to 10. This actually started a bit of a panic with everyone wanting to know what was going on. When DC Universe told people not to worry, it seemed like everything was fine until... The reason the show was cancelled still isn't really clear, though multiple sources have given their different reasons, and most of them have related to budget. So it's pretty safe to assume the show ended up costing way more than anticipated. But I'm not here today to talk about the show's ill fate, and more so my thoughts on the show itself. And as much as I'd love to praise the show in hopes of it being renewed, the truth is, I have very mixed feelings on it. Swamp Thing is a show that toyed with my emotions, as there were plenty of things that I liked about it, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that it's kind of a mess. To quickly sum up my thought process while watching the show, it starts off with a pretty good first episode, not one I loved, but good nonetheless. Episode 2 greatly improved upon the first, putting heavy emphasis on the horror and preparing me for what I thought was gonna be a spooky, fun time. Unfortunately, it was past that point that I found the show getting rather dull. It wasn't until the last 2 or 3 episodes that the show started to win back my investment, but by that point, the show was over. Not just the season, the entire show. But before getting into my many gripes I have about Swamp Thing, I want to tell you guys all the things that I enjoyed about it, because there was quite a bit that I admired. For one, the casting in this show is excellent. I really feel that all these actors dedicated 100% of themselves to these roles. Derek Mayers was excellent as Swamp Thing, and unless the show does get renewed, it's going to be hard to see anyone else in that role because he is perfection. Avery Sutherland and Jason Woodrue were also real highlights of the show, portraying villains that felt believable. The production design is above average for a DC show. It's far better looking than anything on the CW, and the town the show takes place in gives off a perfect Southern Gothic atmosphere. The effects are also well done, and a lot of the creepy plant stuff in the first few episodes were very well executed. I really like that scene that paid tribute to John Carpenter's The Thing in the first episode. The makeup on Swamp Thing himself is a work of art, and anytime he was on screen, I could not take my eyes away. I never would have imagined that in this day and age, we'd be getting another Swamp Thing played by an actor in a suit, but I sure am glad that I got to see it. Unfortunately, that's not very often. Now, if I had to pick out some reasons as to where I think the show went wrong, I can come up with 2 main ones. 1, creative differences, and 2, there's too much focus on characters that don't need it. Need I remind you, the latter is actually the exact same mistake made by Titans in its first season. One of the many rumors I read about this show's behind the scenes issues is that the original intention was to make a Swamp Thing show that would be straight up scary. Unfortunately, execs hate horror, so they had them tone the show down into more of a thriller. This is a big problem because when the show is going full-blown horror, it's good. But whenever it tries to build suspense or keep you invested in its unfolding mystery about a deadly disease in the swamp, it starts becoming extremely dull. Much of the story isn't interesting enough to keep me invested, and at a certain point I kind of forgot what the plot was because there was too many stories going on at once. Which brings me back to my second point, there are far too many separate plots going on in the show. In most episodes of shows, there are no more than 2 stories at a time. This is of course known as the A-plot and the B-plot, with the A-plot being the one of the most importance. Here there really isn't an A or B plot, more so just multiple plots all treated with equal importance. This was frustrating to deal with because I couldn't get a grasp of which story I was supposed to be invested in. I know the only story I was invested in was Abby and Swamp Thing's, but for those watching a Swamp Thing show for that reason, you're pretty much just setting yourself up for disappointment. Now I know that lots of makeup is uncomfortable to be in and a big issue that actors have to overcome. But isn't the whole point of picking a practical suit over CG is to use it more and spend less money? I hope you like Blue Devil, cause surprise, his origin is in this show and yes, he gets way too much screen time. That brings me to another problem that a lot of shows and movies seem to run into today, and it's the idea that everything has to have its own shared universe. It was revealed by one of the people that worked on Swamp Thing that the original idea was for Swamp Thing to lead to other DC horror shows, and eventually a Justice League Dark show, which would have been pretty cool. But the issue I take with that is that they sacrifice telling a well-structured, focused story just to set up this universe. It's the same thing that movies like Batman v Superman, Amazing Spider-Man 2, or The Mummy did, and it's gonna keep happening so long as Marvel's making those big bucks. While the writing itself isn't horrendous, there were plenty of aspects of the show I felt were handled in a sloppy way. It honestly felt like the show was jumping at an opportunity to get away from its title character whenever it could. The amount of times that Abby traveled all the way out to the middle of the swamp by boat just to realize she had to be somewhere else and then immediately leave became almost comical. On top of that, there are also multiple scenes in which cops arrive to a crime scene only for cops to overlook that Abby is at every single one. I know she's not behind any of them, but just small things like that stood out to me and could have been handled much better. I will actually say that I enjoyed Swamp Thing a lot more towards the end of the show. I think my reasoning for this is because it finally felt like the plot was progressing, as well as more focus was being put on Swamp Thing like I wanted to begin with. By that point, the show was starting to feel more familiar to me, like what I'd expect from a show called Swamp Thing. The last episode is a bit of a mess, like with all of these DC Universe TV shows, but all things considered, they did the best with what they had, and I actually consider the finale to be one of the more enjoyable episodes, even if the conclusion is weak. Oh, also, hyping up that end credit scene? Yeah, complete dick move, you guys. Overall, Swamp Thing is a show that I really wanted to like, but at the end of the day, I think I'll just say it was okay. Like I said, there were a few episodes I enjoyed, but unfortunately at the end of the day, those duller episodes are still there. Despite my complaints, I would still love to see Swamp Thing return, maybe on HBO Max or Netflix. I may have been rather hard on the show, but the show ended right as I was warming up to it, and to me, that's the worst part of all of this. Whether or not you should watch Swamp Thing, I'm gonna leave it up to you. Thank you to everyone who watched. I just want to let you guys know that I'll be starting full-time college again in a few days, so I may not be able to do as many videos as I have been. I'm sorry about that, but there's plenty of other videos on this channel that you can check out in the meantime. Thanks again to all who supported me, and I hope to have more content out as soon as I can. Bye.